All right, so this is going to be a deck profile and the deck that I'm bringing to the newest Commander format tournament. The deck commander is going to be Manticore Darkness, and this is kind of a spec that's special to me because when I was younger, one of the first decks that I kind of came up with on my own and built on my own with like an original strategy was a Gravity Bind deck that had a lot of attack directly monsters to do damage to my opponent's life points and then a lot of burn cards in it. So this is pretty similar to that deck. So it's kind of special. The reason why I built this deck particularly is because I just kind of wanted to try something different. When we saw the tournament results for the last tournament, the second place deck ended up being a beatdown burn hybrid deck, and I wanted to take a more different route to that approach, but something kind of similar, where it was more just a lockdown burn with some attack directly monsters as well that could put a lot of pressure on my opponent. So the deck commander, Manticore Darkness, the fire attribute is actually kind of important. I've kind of said before that I think fire attribute is probably the worst attribute out of all the available ones for this format. But for this type of strategy, it does have some pretty important cards. And then the Beast Warrior isn't a very good typing, but because Manticore Darkness is a special card for this format, it also gives me access to Beast and Wing Beast monsters, which are the much more important attribute or the typings, especially specifically Beast. There's a lot of really good burn Beast cards. So we're just gonna get right into the deck. What is funny though is that in my last video, when I was talking about the deck that I won the last tournament with, I said that one of the big things is to make sure that your commander is not only a good attribute and typing for your deck, but it's also just a good card in its own. Which Manticore Darkness is a fine card, don't get me wrong, but for this strategy, it's pretty much useless because it's going to not be able to attack under a lot of my own floodgates. But there is one very specific use that I can use for it. There have been some times in testing where I just kind of summon it out where I don't have any floodgates and try to attack with it and have it as like a strong 2300 monster. But most of the time, I ended up running into just like a battle trap, and at that point, usually the game's lost if it does get to that point. So let's start with the deck. First card here is the Desk Koala. This put in a lot of good work during testing. Whenever I flipped this over, a lot of times my opponent was having, five, six cards in their hand and was doing quite a bit of damage, like 2000 plus damage. So um, the stats on this card are really good as well. The 1800 defense is a lot of times enough just to wall off opponent's monsters from being able to destroy it. And then the 3-star means that it can attack, which the 1100 attack is pretty nice because if I can attack directly, that's a nice, good amount of chip damage. But also, if say something like level limit area B is up, a lot of the traditional beater monsters have that crippling weakness to Tsukiyomi, where if their defense is 1,000 or less, then they can be destroyed. So that's cool. I can take advantage of that with against cards something like um, Chiron the Mage. That's pretty problematic for this deck because of how much back row that I run, and I don't want to destroy my back row. Panda, I haven't gotten to use this quite yet, but it's the same thing. I mean, there's a whole deck in very traditional Go format called Panda Burn, so there's obvious reasons. Plus, because we are running Manticore, we can run Beasts, which means that we can run Ojama Trio because the tokens are Beasts. So that's obvious. It's a pretty obvious pairing with Panda. And if your opponent just has two monsters on the field, then this gets beefed up to a pretty good stat total. Inaba does work. It definitely puts in a lot of pressure on my opponent. It's just a funny card to me. I always like the spirit monsters, but like summoning a rabbit and then attacking your opponent directly, and then at the end phase it goes back to your hand where it's safe and your opponent can't destroy it with their own monster, like or even like play like fissure or smashing ground on it or something to kill it, like it's safe in your hand. Like you have to do something to kill it the turn it's summoned. Basically, it's just funny, but a lot of times this does put enough pressure on my opponent that they have to spend a mirror force or a sakuretsu armor or something to kill it. Otherwise they're just going to take continual 700 chip damage, and that chip damage will add up to eventually where I can use some of my combo pieces to do some burst damage with like just desserts or wave motion cannon or secret barrel, stuff like that, and kind of go for a game winning push. So he puts in good chip damage and usually forces my opponent to do something to answer him. Stealth Bird, unfortunately, this hasn't done very well in testing. I know it's a good card. just because it does put on pressure. But this is like a lightning rod for Nobleman to cross out a lot of times, which is unfortunate because once the opponent sees that they're going to be taking 1,000 damage every turn unless they do something to stop this card, that's pretty much going to force them to play something on it. So unfortunately, it hasn't put in the work that I want it to because it just so desperately forces my opponent to do something to answer it. But it's also a good card because of that. And in situations where it doesn't, my opponent doesn't have an answer for it, then I'm just going to be flipping this over and doing 1,000 damage each turn, which is going to be good. Unfortunately, the 1700 defense isn't quite enough to keep it alive. Unlike Dusk Koala, 1800 is kind of like that cutoff point where, in this format, a lot of if you're putting like just a normal monster in your deck that's just there to be a beater monster, like 1800 is pretty much the cutoff. If it's 1700 or lower, then you just kind of don't put it in your deck, is what I've seen for most decks. This is really good. It helps me search out things that I need basically for whatever situation. So if I don't have a floodgate card, then I can use this and put Gravity Bind or Ordeal the Traveler on top of my deck. If I need a burn card to try to push for game or just get in more damage, I can search out something like Ring of Destruction. If my opponent has a problematic card, or Ceasefire, Secret Barrel, Call of the Haunted. If I want to bring back a monster to try to start doing some damage, or if I need some protection, I can search out Solemn Judgment and Magic Jammer or Fake Trap, things like that. Just because I got so many trap cards, like this has a lot of versatility to it. So this is basically just always a good card. Lava Golem's good for obvious reasons. Just being able to destroy two of my opponent's monsters is really nice because this deck doesn't really focus on monster destruction. A lot of it is just me under the assumption that my opponent's monsters are kind of going to be useless for them in most situations. So they have like a Goblin Attack Force, but I've got Gravity Bind up, then Goblin Attack Force is pretty much useless. So that's the idea. But there are some cards, monster cards, that can put in work, something like Jinzo, Sacred Phoenix of whatever, that destroys all the back row when it gets special summoned from its effect. Desk Koala that will, or not Desk Koala, Desk Wombat that will just negate all the effect and burn damage from my deck. Things like that I just need to get out of the field. I can use Lava Golem to distribute those off. And then plus the burn damage, 1,000 per turn is pretty nice. The bad thing is that it's kind of easy to get rid of a lot of times just because you can distribute summon this. But when I looked at the top 4 decks from the last tournament, every deck was only averaging about 1 tribute summon monster per deck. Now, unfortunately, if my opponent is running a commander that's a tribute summon like mine, obviously, then they can just tribute off Lava Golem for that. So it does kind of lose value in that situation, but it's still good enough, I think. Just getting rid of 2 monsters on my opponent's side of the field alone, I feel is enough to run this deck or run this card. And then the extra burn damage is really nice. This is a pretty mid card. It just does 500 damage per end of the turn. If I had the ability to run 2 of these, and it'd be a better card because I could have 2 of them on the field at the same time and lock out my opponent as like another floodgate scenario. But obviously it's Highlander, so I can only run 1 of them. So it's like just good enough to be played in the deck just because like a little bit of chip damage is kind of nice. But other than that, it's pretty meh. And plus it's searchable by UFO Turtle, I guess, but most of the time I'm probably going to be searching something else. UFO Turtle has 4 good targets. This is also a target, but it's not something I want to target with UFO Turtle because I want to set it. So it's got 4 good targets, so that's good to have. It's just a wall. Same thing with Charcoal Apache. It's just a wall. Iron Blacksmith. I've only got 2 equipped cards to search. I did have 3. I think I had Mask of Restrict originally in this deck, but it didn't test very well. It just didn't do quite enough. The 500 damage per turn with Mask of Restrict just wasn't enough to be impactful, and it was too easy to get around it with like tribute summons. And it held up like a back row slot that was kind of important, so I decided not to run it. I felt like Hammer Shot was just like a better card if I wanted that, or if I wanted to like just something to get rid of a monster, I guess, instead of just like locking it down and doing a little bit of burn damage. Charcoal or Raging Flame Sprite does really good work. This is a very good card of putting pressure on my opponent. If they don't answer it, damage is going to rack up pretty quickly. This usually forces out a Battle Trap, which like I've got just enough like attacking monsters between Raging Flame Sprite and Naba and Kakugiri Panda that my opponent can't like side out all of their battle traps because they're going to need them to deal with these cards. But at the same time, most of the duel, like those battle traps, aren't going to be very helpful. So it's kind of a weird situation I put my opponent in. I also need to be careful of Raging Flame Sprite because if I attack a couple of times with Raging Flame Sprite and get it up to 3,000 attack, and I've got Gravity Bind or Level Limit Area B helping me to protect me, I can very easily have my opponent snatch steal this card away from me and just start using it to fucking kill myself, which would be terrible, or something like Brain Control. So definitely a card that I need to be careful with because I don't want it to lose me the duel when I don't when it's a situation where I don't need to use it, and I could win without it. I just definitely be careful of not losing to my own card, which would be hilarious and sad at the same time. Level limit area B is self-explanatory. Messenger of Peace. Originally, I didn't have this in the deck, which ended up being really stupid with hindsight. Originally I didn't put it in because of stuff like Raging Flame Sprite and Gaku Gary Panda. Like I was just thinking, like I don't want level Messenger of Peace because it prevents my own cards from attacking. But it's literally just those two. Like I guess as well Manticore, but I don't really give a fuck about Manticore. So these two, it would prevent them from attacking. But like the Floodgate is just so valuable. Like it's so much more valuable to make sure that I don't get swarmed and killed by my opponent's beater monsters, which I'm expecting most decks to have. That Messenger of Pieces is too valuable to not put in the deck. Sword's obvious. Scapegoat. This is just a good card for stalling. Unfortunately, I don't have anything to pair with it. Like Amazon's Archers would be amazing, but that's an Earth Warrior that I can't put in this deck. But it would be amazing to be able to combo with that and be able to do like 2,400 points of damage in one turn with burn damage by tributing off all the tokens. That would be quite amazing. I do think that this deck would work with things like Scapegoat as the commander, or um, what's the other thing that's like this? Oh, Enraged Battle Ox that has the same conditions as Manticore Darkness, where you can use the Beast and Wing Beast typings. I do think that you can combo with that. Like the fire monsters are good, but like they're not necessary to run this type of deck. You can run stuff like Dream Clown and Golem Sentry, Amazoness Archer, like I said earlier, along with um, Giant Rat, and then you still get your Beast type monsters like Duskwall. That's really important. You would maybe lose out like Stealth Bird and this thing, the cat, on if you played Scapegoats, but I definitely do think that there's a way to do this burn control stall deck with Earth attribute as well. But I wanted to do it with the fire attribute. I wanted to do something a little bit different. See if try to like shake up the game and maybe see if there's other viable strategies out there. Snatch Steal, like I said, this is just a combo to tribute set Manticore. Premature Burial, this is good to just get back anything. So like Raging Flame Sprite, or Dakuhiri Panda, or Stealthberg to try to put pressure on my opponent with those kind of monsters. Book of Moon, like I said, Death Koala a lot of times puts in like 2,000 points of damage whenever it gets flipped, just because of how grindy these games can be if I do get my floodgates up and protect them. Also, it can be used against stuff like Jinzo or Death Wombat that sets off my trap cards or my effect damage. I can just Book of Moon those cards face down and then start doing damage or get rid of them. So it's a really good utility card. This is just a really good burn card, obviously. These are, Trinity pieces. Obviously, no duo because I don't really need it. I'm kind of expecting most of my opponent's cards to be dead in hand with this type of strategy. But the Traveler, this is probably like the worst floodgate because of how trap heavy my deck is. So a lot of times I would get in situations where I remember one time where I had three traps in hand and I had my only floodgate was already the Traveler. So I play it on an attack. My opponent calls monster on one of the cards that they select. It wasn't a monster, it was a trap. And then next time they attack, they're obviously going to call trap card again because they saw it in my hand. And I wasn't able to even bluff set anything because my back row is all full. And literally all I had was trap cards in my hand. So unfortunately, this like just because of the dynamic and the structure of the deck, it's kind of not the best floodgate, but it's still kind of necessary just because it's so important to be able to get those floodgates. If I don't get my floodgates and prevent my opponent from just attacking and swarming and killing me, then usually the duel goes pretty poorly. Another floodgate. Curse of Darkness. This just does 1,000 damage any time a player activates a spell card. This deck only has 10 spells, which is intentional because of this card. But when I was looking at the previous top four decks, a lot of them were kind of spell card heavy. My winning deck was the lowest spell card deck with like 12. And then I think TK's only had like 13, but a lot of the other decks had, 15 plus spell cards, which is kind of what I'm expecting to be because of the Highlander format style of this Goat Commander format, that a lot of decks will kind of be spell card heavy. So, if my opponent wants to play like Nobleman Cross out on Stealth Bird or something like that, or any just set monster that I have, they're going to have to pay. If they want to play Pot of Greed to get those cards, to try to search for a Heavy Storm, they're going to have to pay 1,000 life points. So that will whack up and punish them for that. Ceasefire is a good burn card. Same thing with Secret Barrel, especially because I can combine it with Ojama Trio. Magic Cylinder, it was a good card in my last deck. It is an even better card in this one. Ring Destruction, obvious. Nightmare Will, it's not the best card because you can tribute whatever it's attached to, obviously, but it's good enough, and it's probably also can prevent my opponent from doing flip summons if they have any of those as well. So it's just good enough to be in the deck, I feel. Just Desserts isn't amazing because a lot of times my opponent doesn't have a lot of monsters on the field. Like it's hard to be able to par it with Ojama Trio when you're only running one of each. But on the opposite side, like my opponent only needs to have like two monsters on their side of the field, and this does 1,000 damage. And it feels like 1,000 damage is enough to justify putting it in the deck at the very least. Ojama, obviously, it goes well with Just Desserts and Secret Barrel, like Panda Bird, and then also Panda itself. So that's pretty self-explanatory. Plus, it just locks up zones from my opponent so that they can't summon like a bunch of beater monsters to threaten me with. These are obvious. Call the Haunted. Same thing with Premature Burial. Just brings back monsters that I can pressure with. Ooh, whoops. Oh well. I just won't save it. Solemn Judgment, just to protect my stuff, my back row, my floodgates. Same thing with Magic Jammer, Spell Shield type 8. Also, this can protect my monsters from stuff like Snatch Steal and Nobleman Crossout. Fake Trap, again, just to protect my back row. So I got like 4 cards just to dedicated to protecting my floodgates as well. So it's just kind of showing how important the lockdown part of this deck is. And then my side deck is mostly built for the mirror matchup. So I got stuff like Chiron, Death Wombat, Ultimate Baseball Kid. I wanted to put in the main deck, but just kind of wasn't quite good enough. I only have like I think 5 or 6 fire monsters in this deck. The effect damage like from tributing a fire monster is kind of nice too, but I don't know. But in the sense of like a mirror matchup, I think it gets better value. So I put in the side deck. Dark Core is really good because it can banish things. So if my opponent is running something like Jinzo or Sacred Phoenix Wing thing and Death Wombat, things that are really annoying, if I use Dark Core, it doesn't just destroy them, it banishes them. So that way they also can't bring it back with Call of the Haunted or Premature Burial, things like that. So Dark Core is pretty nice for that. Hammer Shot, if the Jinzo is face up on the field, it's probably going to be the strongest monster face up on the field because my monsters are all pretty weak. So Hammer Shot's pretty good for that situation. Offerings to the Doomed, it's just a good spot removal card for stuff like Jinzo, like I said earlier. The not being able to draw is kind of bad because this deck is not very efficient. There's a lot of like discards for like Magic Jammer and Spell Shield type 8. It's not a very efficient deck, so missing on the draw can be detrimental, but Jinzo is a lot worse because I'm running 18 cards or 18 trap cards. D spells, that's just for stuff like Wave Motion Cannon if my opponent's running it like a burn deck. Double Snare kills Jinzo and Royal Decree. Royal Decree is pretty big. I don't think most people are going to be running Royal Decree because most decks from, well, last tournament, no one had Royal Decree in their main deck or side deck for the top 4. And then almost every deck was running like I think 8 to 12 trap cards on average. So I don't expect many decks to be running Royal Decree because they don't want to basically turn off that many of their own cards. But just in case they do, I got this. Same thing with MST. Giant Trunade. Mage Power, I almost put this in the main deck, but it's not really a much of an attack focused deck. But I think with Mage Power, I could very easily get like a 1,500 attack point boost with it just because of how back row heavy the deck is. Raigeki Break, just a good spot removal. Bad Reaction to Smochi, it's just kind of funny, but just on the off chance that one of my opponents has something in their side deck that heals them and gives them life points, yeah, Bad Reaction to Smochi to just kind of negate that. Stuff like Solemn Wishes and spell absorption. They're running those type of things to try to like just bolster their life points early on and make it so that my burn cards just aren't enough to kill them. Solemn Wishes, just in case I run into a burn mirror matchup, I can add this in my deck and basically do the exact same thing, which is I can just kind of increase my own life points to keep myself alive. Bottomless Trap Hole is just a good card, and then my fusion deck, that's just all the possible fusions that I can have that I probably will never use. And then we'll just go to some of the problematic cards for this deck and some of the cards that I wanted to add but didn't add. So I've kind of already went over some of these, but Chiron's a problem. Death Wombat's a problem. This will destroy my floodgates, and then Death Wombat just negates all my effect damage, my burn damage. King Tiger's a little bit annoying, but it's not that huge. Mystic Swordsman is a little bit annoying as well. It's not like it's not something that like hard counters my deck, but it can be kind of annoying if it kills something like Death Wombat or Stealth Bird. Mobius will put in work just because of how back row heavy the deck is, but it's limited to water, which I don't think is going to be the most popular attribute. The Phoenix Wing, I've already went over. Again, it's not the most popular attribute, so I'm hoping not to see it much. Jinzo puts in work, but it's machine, and machine's pretty decent, so I might see Jinzo, I might not. Also, Blowback Dragon, another machine that's pretty good. So machines are something that I don't want to see. Will Decree, I don't expect many decks to have. Zing could be a really big issue. When I made my deck profile of my winning deck, I spoke glowingly of how good Zing was. So I kind of expect people, if they watch that video, to be putting Zing in their deck. It's just so good. And I can't really afford to have two of my back row slots just locked down, especially since I'm not running MST in my main deck, which may or may not be a good or bad choice. But even just like not the fact that I lose those cards, but the fact that those back row slots are locked down. Because when you're thinking about it, like I have to have one floodgate up at pretty much all times, otherwise I'm going to die. And then I have to have something to protect that floodgate, like a Kaiji Jammer or a Solemn Judgment. And then that leaves me just one open slot to play my burn cards. And like most of my deck is trap cards, so I'm gonna have to set it and then wait a turn and then play it. And it's just so slow that like Zinc could be really detrimental. And then these are most of the back row removal cards that I expect most decks to have. So Heavy Storm, MST, Dust Tornado, or Geki Break maybe. Some cards decks might or might not have it. Snatch Steal, I said, it could be a problem just because of Raging Flame Sprite. And then these little insect things could be annoying. Mostly the Swarm of Locusts because it can pick off my floodgates, similar to Chiron. That could be annoying. The good thing is that Swarm of Locusts defense is pretty low. It's at like 500, so almost some of my lower attack monsters could be able to kill it, like Death Wombat or Descola, I mean. And then these are some of the cards I thought about putting in the deck, but just didn't quite make it. So Tornado Bird, I can flip this and add spell cards to either player's hand, whichever the controller is. Giant Rat, I mean, it's obvious that with Panda Burn, this is kind of an obvious pairing with it, but I think in my deck, like Giant or Panda is like the only target for Giant Rat, and GFO Turtle just ended up being the better recruiter. Blade Rabbit is kind of like a weaker Dream Clown, but it's meh. United Fan, I thought about maybe just combining this with Scapegoats, but like I said, it's not a very attack focused deck. I already went over why this wasn't really that good. Chain Energy, this is something that you kind of associate with most burn decks, but I felt like this could be really detrimental to myself. If I, early on, I don't draw a Floodgate card and I get low on life points, I could just create a situation where Chain Energy is just dead. Plus, like, in the same sense that like Solar Flare Dragon is better with two of them, like Chain Energy a lot of times is better with two, is because like a lot of times your opponent can afford to pay like 500 life points per card that they play, but 1,000 life points per card they play can be enough to just kill them. And then the same thing with this one, it's just an increasing damage to both players. So the same reason why I'm not playing it as Chain Energy is that if I get low on life points early, then this becomes a dead card. Tower of Babel is really interesting because it was another way to like lock out spell cards from my opponent. But I ended up going with Curse of Darkness instead. I felt like there was too many situations where I could have this at like 3 counters, and then a situation where my opponent destroys one of my floodgates, and then I'm sitting with like level limit area B or Swords are very light in my hand, and I have to play it to not die. But then if I play it, I'm going to take 3,000 damage from my own card, and that sucks. And so I decided not to put it in the deck. So that was just a rundown of my deck and my thoughts on it. A lot of this deck was kind of built just on thought process. I did very little testing. I think like only 5 duels or so. I didn't really want to do a lot of testing too because I didn't want to give away my strategy and give or tip people off on how to side deck for it or that they need a side deck for burn, because a lot of the decks in the last tournament did not side deck much for burn. Like I think like Chiron the Mage is in a lot of decks, but like not something like Death Wombat or D-Spell, even things like that that will get rid of back row. So if people do lose to this deck, it's probably because they didn't prepare for burn very well. So that's a just an interesting video to do before the tournament, and then I'll make another one after the tournament, just kind of going over the results and how cards played out. And should be fun. So hopefully, I will see you at the tournament, and best of luck to everyone that takes part.